to respond a little bit to John's report. I'll talk about at least 3 issues, and if I've got time, I'll go on to the 4th. The 3 issues I do want to cover are, firstly, John's approach to the research on which the report's based. Academics love talking about methods and always go on about that kind of stuff. It's not very interesting for most people, so I'll keep that quite short, but I think it is important. The second is I want to say something about the origins of support for the BNP in this city. What I'm going to say on that is based on some research I did a fair number of years ago now, back in 2003, 2004, with a colleague of mine, David Gann. I also want to reflect a little bit on what Juju said about how it's possible to tell a rather different story about the city that's perhaps less bleak than the story John tells. And if I've got time, I'd also want to say a little bit about what I think we can and can't do about the problem of racism and the far right. But if I can start with the kind of John's approach to the report. My concern about this is that it's very much based on cases. It's cases, as he says in his report, drawn from public sources and retained on IRR's files. Now, the problem with working too much with cases in the public domain is, of course, we all know the media like the spectacular and the violent. And we may get a rather misleading impression of what racism is really like in the city if we only consider it on the basis of the spectacular and the unusually violent. That's not to underplay or understate the problem, but I do think we may get a slightly distorted picture if we rely on what the Sentinel or the national press happen to pick up. I also want to say just a little word about the figures. I did actually check the latest figures published by the Ministry of Justice for both reported racial incidents, this is to the police, and convictions for racially aggravated crime. Now the two are running in going opposite directions. 11.4% increase between 2006-10 and 2010-11 in reported racial incidents, and a 26.4% decrease in convictions for racially and religiously aggravated offences. Now the problem with that is you can either say this is good news or bad news or a bit of both. It's good news if more is being reported, it's bad news if more is happening. That's the trouble with dealing with statistics. What exactly does good or bad news mean? So I think you have to be a little bit careful in bounding statistics about, and particularly in interpreting them and how we evaluate them. Moving on then to the origins of support for the BNP. I completely agree with John when he says that the idea that support for the BNP is simply a protest vote or them filling the political vacuum that's been left as Labour's gone to the right and the Tories have gone to the left, although we can argue about whether the Tories are still going to the left. We can also obviously recognise that the BNP is not the political force that it was, but what I'm concerned about is that to search for an explanation purely in the failings of political parties, the fact that mainstream parties have tried to adopt and indeed endorse the racist rhetoric of the far right, is, I think, an oversimplification in itself. And the tenor of John's report, as far as I read it, is that it is largely, racism is largely the responsibility of the mainstream parties affirming and endorsing the racism of the far right. I think that in itself is an inadequate explanation. I think it's part of the explanation, but it's an inadequate explanation. And like Jude, I do have to say that I think John was slightly selective in pulling out a quote from one of the pieces that Dave Gann and I published, which gave the impression that we in some way endorsed that in our research, confirmed that finding. It was much more complicated than that, I promise you. So it's slightly galling to be quoted in quite such a selective way. Why did the BNP gain such support in the city? Well, I think some of the credit has to go to everybody's favourite fascist, Nick Griffin, who managed to take the Nazism behind closed doors, give or take the odd investigative reporter. He did make the BNP perhaps slightly more acceptable in electoral terms. The other thing I think we have to recognise, and this was found in some research done by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust in the elections of the early 2000s, was that many people are attracted to the BNP, surprisingly. These are voters rather than activists. Not because of their positions on immigration or asylum, but because of their image as rebels, as people who are going to give the conventional parties, the mainstream parties, a bit of a bloody nose. So I think we have to be quite careful to understand why people support the BNP and not just assume, or the far right, and not just assume it's entirely reducible to fears or concerns about immigration and racial prejudice. The third point I want to make is that during our research, we talked to people who would, in no possible context, vote for the BNP. Nice, middle-class, respectable people who think the BNP, who thought the BNP were basically a bunch of hooligans and street folks, but who would be just as racist as the people who would vote for the BNP. In fact, as the BNP themselves. And we tend, I think, to see the kind of white working class vote for the BNP as being somehow uniquely racist. It isn't. There are people who would vote for the BNP who would never vote for the BNP who are just as racist as the people who do. And we need to recognise that when we talk about the BNP and the far right. The final point I want to make is that I think there's always a danger of reading off racism and support for the far right from a set of structural conditions. That if we have economic recession, if we have a centripetal movement in conventional politics, if we have a time of social change, that means that more people are going to support the far right and more people are going to be racist. What I think we have to realise is that often people support the BNP, support the far right, the EDL or whatever, for quite personal reasons. And there are people who are in exactly the same social and political circumstances who resist the temptation to support the far right. So we have to understand, this is one of the most important points we made from what we got from our research, is that individual biography is a very, very important factor in understanding why people support the far right and have extremely prejudicial attitudes and may get involved in racially motivated violence. I'll leave my fourth point, but I do want to get into the fourth area, and that is what June was talking about, the other side of Stoke-on-Trent. I must say, I didn't entirely recognise the city from John's report. It was a pretty unremittingly bleak picture, and I don't think that's entirely fair. Just to give a couple of examples of why I don't think it's fair. John refers to the 2001 riot in Cambridge, which of course everybody in Stoke knows wasn't a riot at all. The one thing that emerged very clearly from our discussions with people who were involved in that incident was that was, to use the old cliche, it was a classic example of black and white uniting and fighting together against the invasion of, or the threatened invasion of the BNP and the National Front. We talked to a group of young Asian men who specifically remember standing on the front line with their white neighbours, waiting for the BNP or the NF to come and to contribute to kicking them out. So, in a sense, that can be spun as a much more positive story about community cohesion and self-defence than the fact that here it was again, the NF, BNP, marching in Stoke and attacking minority ethnic communities. One other story which I think is particularly important from our point of view was one of the people we interviewed. We did a life story interview with this guy who'd had a long tradition of involvement in the far right going back to the NF in the 1970s. He'd stood for the BNP in a local election, and bizarrely enough he'd asked the black barmaid in his local pub to vote for him. And even more bizarrely, she had voted for him. He had then had a kind of epiphany and had suddenly realised that the BNP didn't allow black people to be members. And he'd gone along to this woman and apologised for asking her to vote for him because she couldn't join the party. And she said, no, don't worry, I didn't vote for you because you're a member of the BNP. I voted for you because I think you're a good bloke. And I think you would do a good job in my community. Now that, to me, was an incredibly positive response for this young woman to make. That she was able to see beyond this man's political activism, beyond the racism of his party, and to contain it, and to kind of declassify it in a way that I think holds the prospect for where we should be going and how we try and deal with and respond to racism. Now that's a very individual thing, and it's not something that can be replicated, but I think it shows a much more positive side to what can be done to transcend and get over some of the discrimination and the anger and the hatred that manifests itself in racially motivated violence. So I'm going to leave it there. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much to Dr. Dixon for that. Wasn't expecting it to be quite so to have such a high level of discussion. It's quite good. It'll be very tempting to allow the discussion to continue up here, but I think this is the point where we turn around to you. And there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not John's report gave an accurate reflection of the city or not. And so, on that, maybe people would like to say whether or not they think it has or has not. Maybe there's people that have been the victim of racist violence that would like to say a few words. But yeah, I'll turn it over to you. So if you would like to speak, first off, you can raise your hand, nice and high so I can see it. And then I'll indicate to you, and then somewhere around here there should be a microphone like this one. There's a button on the right that says speak. When I indicate, and not before, when I indicate, just press that button and try and keep it to 3 minutes maximum so we can get the most speakers that we can. So would anyone like to speak? Okay, I see you there.
Can you hear me okay, yeah? No cracking. I'll just make a few comments, amongst them will be a couple of questions you might want to address. My experience, mainly with being associated and living with black people, i.e. African descent, Caribbean, etc. And knowing some Asians through taxi driving, because I was a taxi driver. This thing about geography, I came to a Norscarf, it's not Norscarf, I was one secretary of Norscarf. Norscarf meeting in Newcastle, when first time ever, about 6 months ago. And I went along with a black mate of mine from Shelton, born and bred Shelton. I think all he might have come in is 4. He's about 52 now. And at the end of it, it was the one that Mr. Benny, I just forget his first name now, from London. Wayne, is it? Yeah. Was the main speaker. But I was completely misunderstood there. I'm not going to go into that. The thing is, when we came out, just before we came out, the black guy I was with, went over to Wayne and said, you know, we've all moved on. We don't feel any, I as a black person never come across, I've never come across any racism. His sons go to the clubs and everything, he mixes, white, whatever. And that didn't surprise me. because it's all become more blurred now, and there's certain aspects that this PC thing gets in the way. You know, we know there are many Jewish people in Stoke-on-Trent. There used to be quite a community here. There's only a few left now, I think, and one of the main people died 3 years ago. Mr. Morrison. But there's an increase on attacks on Jews up and down the country. What I hear in the news, background news, and they are on a double whammy because they're attacked by the fascists and extremists, Muslim extremists, Islamist extremists, whatever you want to give that. So I think we never. This is why I say it's more blurred. And the other thing I'd like to remind everybody here is that I don't think Britain anyway, you probably don't know this, Britain is not naturally racist. People are not naturally racist. If you ask, I asked some Asian taxi drivers a couple of years ago, quite a few, who do you think was the first Asian MP in Britain? And those that were a little bit political went for Vass, Keith Vass, Lester, I think he's Lester. And yet, the first Asian MPs, born in the subcontinent in India, there was 2 in the 1890s in Stoke, South London, 1/6, and that was when it was predominantly white. And there was another one, I think, in 1928 in London again. Can't remember the party, criminal in London. But that shows to me that people will vote for the right person. They're not, you know, it's just this little minority of people. We all know it's a small minority and they do a lot of damage. But yes, that's much more or less.
Okay, so you just press the red button. Would anyone else like to introduce you or ask a question? Just press the red button.
Yeah, can I do that? Okay, my name's Roger Seifert. Just sorry to make a point that nobody has made and therefore probably no one wishes to discuss further. But there was a question of the international dimension. Not only, I mean, it's 3 elements. Firstly, we shouldn't forget the international dimension of fascism itself. And when we look at the BNP in the UK, even though it is declining, it has strong links in Europe. Pan-Europeanism, fascism is on the rise. We see it in Greece, we see it in Spain, we see 20% of the French population regularly voting fascist, we see it rife in Eastern Europe. So we shouldn't look too closely and just say what's happening here. We have to compare and be aware of the very strong links that our fascists, in all their shape and form, have across the continent and, of course, into North America, Australia, and elsewhere. Secondly, I think it's very important we have the international dimension with regard to the crisis itself. I mean, this is a global crisis. We shouldn't see it just as Stoke-on-Trent or England. It's caused by globalisation itself, the financial system going worldwide into the 2008 crisis, bringing the recession era. But many of the elements of racism and fascism that we experience haven't accelerated in the recession. It's not caused primarily by unemployment or relative deprivation or a squeeze on welfare. It's very much caused by elite propaganda, by people in very serious positions, politically, academically, and in the media, deliberately stirring up the classic divide and rule in order to divert people away from the class nature of this crisis, from the fact that it's the elite who are oppressing us, and in a sense are waging war, class war, against not only British workers, but workers across the continent, and therefore that has a very important international dimension, which of course has a link to migration and immigration itself. I mean, these are international flows. And the third international thing is maybe we should compare Stoke's record, however it's measured, not so much with London or Edinburgh, but with Kiev and Moscow, with Marseille and Shenzhen, with Sydney and Chicago. In other words, if you look across the world, you'll see absolutely appalling appalling racist incidents in Australia, which has high growth, is actually prosperous, has virtually no unemployment. Attacks on Aborigines are growing all the time. And as we speak, they're being evicted from lands which are uranium rich by a Labour government. But we should also be aware that in Sydney there were riots against Libyans, okay, against people of Middle East origin, in a prosperous town, in a prosperous country. So we shouldn't be too clear about the way in which Stoke is portrayed when we look at it internationally, rather than just within this small island. And I think therefore the international dimension should be addressed. It actually poses more dangers, but also ultimately provides more answers, because we can learn very much from other groups and the way they campaign against fascism and racism. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Very good contribution there. I see you back there with the motion.
Gavin Bailey. One of the things that I've been working on for a long time is extremism and Stoke. And one of the things that I think is quite important as regards how we present our work is to try not to create too much fear by the presentation of what's actually going on out there. I mean, returning to Roger's point, and it sort of relates back to Bill and Jude, looking at the statistics, actually Norfolk has a greater number of racist incidents per head of population than Staffordshire. But, you know, places like that are often more problematic, but we don't talk about them. And what I would say is that what we have to do is we've got to find, it's about finding a balance between publicly attacking racism and reassuring people that racism will be taken seriously, it won't be tolerated. But at the same time, we've got to reassure people that racist incidents are rare, and most of the time people do get on. For community cohesion purposes, one of the sort of, to get to community cohesion, we have to start from a position where people actually trust each other and approach each other with openness. And when we have community analysis which says, well, racism starts in particular communities or particular states, and it's always about the white working class versus the Asian Muslims, how do you get, you know, the question is, how do we contribute to that mistrust by constantly allowing the media to pick up on the kind of things that go on here, and then it getting blown out of proportion, like in the summer the Guardian did a piece on the work by Matthew Goodwin and Jocelyn, where, you know, they were basically saying there were hundreds of thousands of people who were preparing for race war, and they knew that that wasn't true. That wasn't really what they wanted to be out in the media, but once it's out there, it's out there. So we have to think carefully about how we present our work, I guess.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else want to make a contribution or ask a question? Maybe give some of their experiences on life in Stoke-on-Trent. Oh, I see you there.
I just basically wanted to pay tribute really to Joy Garner, the upcoming Labour candidate for the PCC. She's taken a bit of a bash in the media for obviously going forward with the Michael Coleman incident. And what a lot of people out in the media don't realise is she did that way before she was elected as the Labour candidate for the PCC. And I think it's incumbent on everybody in this chamber to get as many people that they know to vote on November the 15th. Because, let's be honest, if the PCC candidate happens to be a Tory and that is elected, they won't stand up against racism as well as Joy. And I think we should recognise that. The second thing is that I think in my time as editor-in-chief of Bits and Bots, the socialist movement to the left took their eye off the ball years ago, and that allowed the BNP a foothold in Stoke-on-Trent. And that might sound a harsh thing to say, but I come from Abbey Oldham. My dad you know, as a socialist voter all his life. But he actually was quite drawn to the BNP, not because he had any problem with anybody with a different race, it's because they promised to fill the void that the Labour Party and Socialist parties once did. So they were getting out there, listening to casework, being and really, that allowed the BNP the foothold. If I'm completely honest, I think most people in Stoke-on-Trent, people who voted for BNP races, no, I don't. But I think they actually offered something that a few people were quite willing to listen to. And one of the things that we always try to do is to get the BNP, the EDL, the NF to be heard, because the biggest opponents and their biggest or best campaigning tool against the BNP is the BNP themselves, because they can't shoot themselves in the foot. They're brilliant at it. And the more that we get that, and people like the Centre will cover that, this city will never turn to the far right again. Thank you.
Thank you. Just quickly on Joy Garden as well, I think it's important to note there's a letter that Jason had published in the Sentinel did, that although Joy thankfully did give some fantastic evidence in the case, it was actually the Crown Prosecution Service that decided that what Corbyn said was so abhorrent that it actually needed to be changed up. But thank you very much again to Joy for the evidence that she did give and following through with that. So would anyone that hasn't spoken, see the guy that just there? Yeah, you.
Get this machine fixed. Yeah. Bob Bison from Newcastle and former activist in Norscarf about 2000 to 2010, I think, and ex-chairman. Certainly, I much prefer Troy Garner as the better of the two candidates, but I don't think we should put all our eggs in the police commissioner basket, because I think the idea of having a police commissioner, which was a Tory idea in the first place, is basically a bad and anti-democratic idea. The idea that any one individual should have these powers of hiring, firing, the chief constable and all the rest of it. In the past, we haven't perhaps seen or heard very much of them, but there's been a democratic police authority with a number of representatives on it. That seems to be a better idea. And, I mean, there's probably going to be a very small turnout on November the 15th, which is understandable. And I think we're spending too much of our time in politics concentrating on individuals. Let's not have a democratic Greater London Council, let's have a mayor. And we've seen what elected mayors can be like here. We're one of the only cities to have had an elected mayor not very much like the experience and reversed the previous model. So don't put your faith too much in individuals, however well-intentioned they may be.
If you could just press the red button.
Could I just say one thing about the media? Just a quick one.
A very quick one, yeah.
Just a quick one on the sentiment. On that Michael Coleman case, I think most people here who saw the Centre editorial will agree that it was absolutely ridiculous what they came out with, more supporting him, trying to hide behind the idea of free speech is okay if it suits the right-wing ones. But I go on the comments page and put things in, make comments, pseudonyms, you have to use pseudonyms there because it's just a free-for-all abusive page. They'll go for it if you put your own name on. But in putting comments on there, I realised, and I discovered something. I was so surprised by it, I got in touch with Private Eye and the newspaper. Because when I came to type in Harmsworth, we got that Swearwood, and so did Rothermere, the others. Just thought, even Private Eye were a bit, I was surprised they didn't know that.
Okay, thank you. I was just going to mention that we've only had male speakers and anyone has indicated to speak. Oh, so would you like to say something? Okay, cool.
In many respects I welcome the report, but it is only of course half the picture. Bill was referred to the inverted commas riot in Cambridge, and people standing shoulder to shoulder there against the incomers, as it were. Some people may have forgotten that the REC then sent quite platoon of young people onto the streets to calm things down, to direct people away from violent reactions. And they made a very positive contribution. If I remember correctly, there was quite a lot of support from the City Council for that. But Jason has mentioned the need for an Equalities Council. And in many respects, I couldn't agree more. But who's going to do the work? Those of you in this council chamber who knew the last Equality Council, knew the good work it did, and know very well why it stumbled so badly and ceased to exist. This was called for an Equalities Council, but this meeting threatens to merely be a talking shop, because we're looking to a report, we're talking about it, but what outcomes are we going to get? I'm a bit beyond steering outcomes at the moment, but I just wonder about it. Otherwise, we've got to have a nice chatty evening, and it hasn't gone very far.
Would you like to say something?
Yeah, sure. I just like to, in the same, just ask Paul, is it, our academic, Bill, yeah. I mean, your invitation to sort of advance our understanding of the reasons behind racism and just to look at the psychological person and the factors of that. I mean, how do you think this, an advancement in our understanding of these reasons will affect, our tools and fight against racism? And how can we translate that in terms of how we fight racism, how we, battle against racism? Thank you.
I suppose what slightly worried both Dave Gard and I as we were doing the research was that the idea that you always challenge racism, you confront it face on, has a kind of superficial attraction. The problem is that a lot of the people who we spoke to, the kind of idea of the liberal elite challenging them, people like Dave and me, these two smart asses from up on the hill, if we had tried to challenge that racism, we wouldn't frankly have got very far. We would have increased their kind of defensiveness. We'd have fed into the whole idea that they are an oppressed minority, an oppressed majority in their own country. So I think you've got to be very careful about how you work around racism. I think the idea of it's something that people can be educated or trained, still less kind of beaten out of, is very problematic. And I think the best way of overcoming it is, that's why I told the story of the barmaid, is by having everything that feeds that racism confounded by an individual, by their own experience. And in some ways it is experience, it is lived experience that will change people. I know that sounds fantastically idealistic, it doesn't translate very well into what we can go out and do tomorrow, but I think in the end that's what probably will change people.
On that note, I'd just like to say actually, Ben let's talk that in the city itself, that in the past we've had the Love Music Hate Racism Festival, and although that's not completely made the city a wonderful anti-racist utopia, I mean, one of the benefits of being a postgrad student is you work alongside a lot of people trying to fund your studies who are quite young. And there was a young 18-year-old lad I was working with in a call centre a couple of weeks ago. I mentioned anti-racism. He suddenly just lit up and explained how wonderful this thing he went to years back when he was a lot younger was. The Love Music Hate Racism Festival did shape the kind of outlook of quite a few young people across the city. And I think that as those young people grow up and become adults and voters and bosses and workers and stuff, that's going to have a huge effect, as it did, I suppose, to kind of confront people with the reality of what racism means. It means that you'll be against the people who produce this music, you'll be against all this wonderful, beautiful tapestry that is the city. But I've just seen that Zeba did indicate to speak, so I'll hand over to her.
Thank you, Gary. I'm Zeba Hanif. I was born and raised in Stoke-on-Trent, and I'm a very proud Stokey. I just want to bring the discussion back to why we're here. It's about racism and racism in Stoke-on-Trent. I've been a victim of racism on many occasions in my life, and I police if they've been racially abused, but I have, and I have on many occasions. Often I get a good response and I get the outcome that I want, but very often I don't. We've talked about reporting today. A few of our speakers have touched on either reporting is, the amount of reporting is increased or is decreased. But when you make that phone call to the police, I mean, and this isn't just my personal experience, this is the experience of many other people, that, to be honest, you make a complaint and it's not taken very seriously. So I'm going to take us back to an experience. I was at my parents' house in Bucknell and their door was kicked and it was damaged. So straight away, that was a cost for my parents. My parents didn't want me to take the complaint forward, but me being me, and I was there, I had to make a complaint, so I contacted the police. And I kept looking out of the window. They live on a main road, so I saw the people that did this. And the more I talked to my parents, it was a regular occurrence. Some of my father would challenge them, and my parents, they were verbally racially abused, and it was the same individuals again and again. So while I was on the phone, I was getting more information from my parents who didn't want to take the complaint forward at the time, but I think that they felt encouraged because I was there. And the officer on the phone took all the information down, and I said, look, I can see them at the co-op store from this window, they're there. Well, there isn't anything we can do at the moment. And I said, well, they're there. I've witnessed what's happened. They've racially harassed my parents before. Why can't you act on it? Well, we can't do anything about it now. We've taken the information and an officer will come to you later. The officer came to them, not to them, they came to me then, because I made the complaint the following day and I didn't hurt his head. So it's not very encouraging, and I know that we've also touched on the police service, and I think our police service, they offer us a fantastic service, and I couldn't offer that, I'll be honest. The work that our frontline officers do is amazing, but at the same time, do the police really take racism seriously? And I appreciate they deal with other matters that are far serious and need more urgent attention, but I think that in the last decade, the training that the police have had is about cultural awareness. It's no use for them. I don't think that was enough for them to know, yes, Muslims pray 5 times a day. That's no use for my parents. What they need to know is that if somebody is making a complaint that's a complaint of a racial attack, then you say to the person on the call that thank you for making this, bringing this to our attention, we are taking this seriously. Not, oh, what would you like me to do with it then? That's what the lady said, and then I think an officer did come and then got a leaflet from victim support through the door. And I don't know what happened if the people that were harassing my parents moved on or they got bored, but it stopped. But they didn't actually get to the individuals. So I think there's training to offer to the police. To tell me on the phone, well, what would you like me to do? There's nothing more I can do. It's not good enough. And that will discourage people to come forward and to discuss their concerns. So I would have liked to have had someone from the police here today and to raise that, but I